the reason people risk their lives on the ocean trying to get here to safety is that life at home is even worse than the risk of dying at sea. In the last 15 years, more than half the boat people who've come here have been Hazaras fleeing the Taliban in Afghanistan and more recently Quetta in Pakistan. And about 99% of them have been assessed as genuine refugees legally entitled to protection. The rest have come primarily from Iran, Iraq, and recently from Sri Lanka. Although, of course, from Sri Lanka they come direct rather than down through the corridor of Malaysia and Indonesia. Yeah. And what is true of the 90+% who've been assessed as refugees is that they are found by our processing to be people with a well-founded fear of persecution on the grounds of their race, religion, social group, etc. Yeah. Unfortunately, they become the whipping boy for politicians who please to call them illegals, although they haven't broken any law by coming here, yeah. Who call them queue jumpers, although there's no queue, and who seem to be completely unconcerned about the fact that a larger number of asylum seekers come here by aeroplane. Those are the people who are able to get travel documents from their country of origin, who are able to get a visa to come to Australia, typically tourist visa, business visa, study visa, whatever. And once they clear passport control, they then make an application for protection. Interestingly, the people who come by aeroplane, the people who aren't risking their lives by coming here, typically about 30 or 40% of them are ultimately assessed as refugees entitled to protection. Yep. They're never locked up. They remain in the community. We're completely untroubled by their presence. Yep. The ones who come by boat, who are sufficiently desperate that they'll risk their lives at sea, they succeed in about 94% of cases over the last 15 years. They get locked up automatically from start to finish. And so here we have this weird position that on the basis of a lie that they're illegal, we mistreat the ones who are almost certainly refugees, and we're not troubled by the ones who are almost certainly not refugees. If anyone can explain the logic of that, I'm fascinated to hear it. The methods of persecution are as various as the human capacity for cruelty, but it includes, at the extreme end, the sort of treatment the Hazaras receive at the hands of the Taliban. At the end of the war in Afghanistan, the Taliban were concerned to clear up areas that had been mined. And so they got groups of Hazara children and stood them shoulder to shoulder and walked them across fields so that the mines would explode if any child walked on one. There's going to be a new generation in Afghanistan of people who are missing one or both lower limbs. The biggest misconception, I think, is that they're illegal, and the present Minister, Scott Morrison, both directly and by dog whistle techniques, has, I think, convinced the majority of Australians that boat people are dangerous criminals from whom we are being protected. That's probably the great misconception. The second misconception, which was fostered by Senator Bob Carr to his eternal discredit, is that they are economic migrants, which is completely inconsistent with the history of the last 15 years, with 94% being assessed as refugees. You can't be both. You're either a refugee or you're moving on solely to improve your economic circumstances, but you cannot be both. Studies over the last 15 years suggest pretty clearly that after about 12 months in detention, most people have got at least one psychiatric disorder, one recognisable psychiatric disorder. And when I say, people detained, I'm talking about people who haven't committed any offence. People who are convicted of a crime they may protest their innocence, but they go to jail, they know why they've gone to jail, they know how long they're going to jail for, and they start counting down the days. These people know they haven't committed any offence, and they can't count down the days because no one can tell them how long they'll be detained for. So after 12 months, typically at least one psychiatric disorder. After 18 months, everyone has at least one psychiatric disorder, and some have more than one. Children seem to go under more quickly than adults, although it's difficult to generalise. When they fall into despair and hopelessness, which typically takes between 12 and 18 months, they will respond in one of two ways. One is to take out their sense of helplessness by attacking their environment. And so you get riots and destruction of property and so on. The alternative is that they start attacking themselves. So they sew their lips together, they go on hunger strikes, they cut themselves, they hang themselves. They do all the things that desperate people will do as a last cry of misery. One case I'm very familiar with is a guy who came from Iraq. He had been imprisoned by the Saddam Hussein regime. He fled and managed to get to Australia. Within 2 weeks of arriving here, the notes kept by the department show that they were aware that he had been imprisoned and tortured by Hussein's regime. They noted that the form of torture that most terrified him was being locked in a small cell, because he'd been locked in a small cell in Abu Ghraib and randomly electrocuted through water in the floor. Now, after about 12 months or a little longer, he began to lose hope and he started self-harming. And so in response to the self-harming, he would cut himself. And to treat him, they would give him Panadol and solitary confinement in a small cell. It didn't help. He would come out and then he would start self-harming again. And they'd give him Panadol and put him in a small cell. This went on for 5 years. And eventually, a lawyer in Adelaide took the case to the federal court and asked for an order no more adventurous than this, that this man should be taken to Glenside Psychiatric Hospital in Adelaide for assessment and, if necessary, treatment. The government resisted it, and I think the case ran for 2 weeks. And eventually the judge ordered that he should be taken to Glenside for assessment and treatment. On admission to Glenside, he was examined physically and psychiatrically, and on the physical examination it was shown he had 10 metres of scarring on his body from self-harming in detention. This was a person who the government strenuously said did not need psychiatric help. So that's what happens to people if you keep them in detention long enough. They go mad. The standard of psychiatric care available is hopelessly inadequate. And it's inadequate not because of any shortcomings on the medical practitioners, but because the opportunities for treatment are so limited. In fact, until recently, and perhaps even now, there was no psychiatric help available to people in Nauru or Manus. And those are the places where the psychiatric harm is worse than in onshore detention. In fact, in the first iteration of the Pacific solution, it took about 12 months, 15 months for people to resort to self-harm. In this iteration, where they're taken there and they are told at the outset, you'll never go to Australia, we can't tell you how long you'll be here, it depends on how the no advantage principle applies to your case, but you should expect to be here for at least 5 years, and after that we don't know where you will go. It took just 9 months for people to start self-harming. So Australia managed to improve on its own personal best performance in driving people mad. I have 2 radically different policy alternatives, each of which could be shaped and tweaked, but they're both different. One, let's pretend that our politicians are actually troubled about people drowning in the dangerous voyage from Indonesia to here. I don't believe it, but let's pretend. Then one way you could stop that straight away is to set up a genuine and fair refugee processing arrangement in Indonesia and perhaps Malaysia. Let people put forward their claims for protection, assess those claims, and if they succeed, then tell them, okay, you're a refugee, you will be safely resettled in, give them a finite time, 2 months, 3 months, whatever it is. It has to be reasonable and it has to be definite. And after that time, you then safely resettle them to Australia, to Britain, to America, to New Zealand, you know, however many countries we can get cooperating. That has 2 practical difficulties, well 3 actually. One is that Indonesia doesn't actually like us very much because we've dissed them so often that they probably wouldn't go along with it. Second is that at the moment, because the last step in the voyage that starts up in that corner and comes down through Malaysia and Indonesia, then you are bound to get a number of tyre kickers coming down to try their luck. They would be economic migrants. Now that's going to cause a demographic problem for Indonesia and or Malaysia. And it's got to be fixed by us, because we'd be asking them to do this to help us. Now, working out how to deal with that problem in 2 countries that are much smaller than Australia and much more crowded than Australia would ever be, that's a problem we would have to work on. But then, given that we spend about $4 or $5 billion a year mistreating the small handful who get here, maybe we can do something to help them. The alternative is this. Let's start from the assumption that the boat trip is an effective filter, and it's certainly proved to be for most of our history. Although January 1788 might be regarded as an exception to that. But the dangerous boat trip is a filter. And let's suppose that we are obsessed about the idea of mandatory detention. I would say initial detention is acceptable. I don't argue for open borders by any means. But if people get here, detain them initially, cap the detention at 1 month, and then release them into the community during the balance of their process, release them in the community in an interim visa with 4 conditions. 1, they have to stay in contact with the department. 2, they're allowed to work. 3, they're allowed Centrelink and Medicare benefits. And 4, crucially, until their refugee status is determined, they must live in a specified regional town or city. Now, if you make the bleak assumption that the high number who arrived here in 2012 became the new normal, and that is highly unlikely, but let's assume it, and let's assume none of them get jobs and stay on Centrelink benefits for the whole time, also highly unlikely, that would cost Australia about $500 million a year. At the moment, we're spending $5 billion a year mistreating them. But of course, the $500 million that it cost us will all be going into the failing economy of regional towns and cities, something which might please them quite a lot. It seems to me, for a fraction of what we're spending at the moment to mistreat people, we could actually treat people properly, benefit the rural economy of Australia, and gradually restore ourselves to a position in the international community where we're respected for our adherence to human rights.